The Minamata Convention began as part of a UN resolution passed in February 2009 in Nairobi because it was acknowledged that mercury was a global problem and needed a global approach to deal with it. So that resolution was very important. It set the beginnings of the negotiating process. There were 7 meetings of the International Negotiating Committee, and the last one took place in Switzerland in January 2013. Later that year, we all went to Japan because Japan felt a particular resonance since it had had the Minamata disease problem in the 1950s, which was not recognised for some time. Other research was done in the Danish communities, and they discovered that there was permanent brain damage, irreversible permanent brain damage done to children before they were born because the mothers were eating fish that contained methylmercury. I got very concerned about that because we all know Pacific Island people eat a lot of fish. So then I discovered there was very little data about the Pacific Islands, in South Pacific in particular, whether methylmercury might be a problem for us. So the group that I work with internationally, which is International Pollution Elimination Network, put together a proposal to United Nations Environment Programme for us to carry out sampling of human hair. We chose to do women aged 18 to 44 years because that's considered childbearing age because of our concerns with children being born with irreversible brain damage. We started off with 3 countries in the Pacific, and then we eventually managed to do 7 countries, including the Cook Islands. So I interviewed 30 people in each country about what species of fish they had eaten in the 2 weeks before we did the hair sampling. I worked with women's organisations because I only had a short time to organise these meetings, and so the women's organisation in each country would call the volunteers together. Then I had to explain to them what the research involved, and then we had to get a consent form signed in accordance with the UNEP protocol. The women from the hosting organisation usually did the hair cutting after I showed them how to cut little samples from people's heads, and then I took care of the labelling, which was really, really important, and dispatching off to the Biodiversity Research Institute in Maine in the US for analysis. When the results came back, they were, as expected, high. The EU acceptable level is 1 part per million, and the results were all higher than that. However, one group in the Pacific were close to that 1 part per million level, which is considered lower for us. And it turned out that that community was too poor to eat fresh fish, so they ate mostly tinned skipjack tuna. So that was, a very interesting contrast to other countries like ours where we eat albacore or marlin, barracuda, flying fish, which we call, what's the name for flying fish? Maroro. So these all have been found to have in other countries high methylmercury content. The good news was all the people that had been given hair samples, who gave hair samples, did not appear to be mentally or physically impaired by such high body burdens of methylmercury. I discovered that in Canada they had done research on Inuit people in the far north and found that they had their gut had adapted to try and eliminate the worst aspects of the mercury, and they thought that there might be another chemical called selenium in the fish which helped also to reduce the impacts of the methyl mercury. So the conclusion is, in the Pacific at least, first of all, we need to stop ocean pollution so that less mercury substances go into the ocean. I was asked how come a small group of islands in the middle of the Pacific would have such high methyl mercury levels, and this is where our science comes in, where the mercury is produced in the vapour of, for instance, coal-fired power stations. Then it's transported by wind and water very far from the source, and when it rains, the methyl mercury comes down from the clouds into the seawater. And for some reason, in seawater or salt water, the process where mercury changes into an organic form called methyl mercury happens faster in salt water than in fresh water. So then our migratory fish species swim through the water and take it up as part of their feeding. The rule of thumb is that the larger the fish or the longer its life cycle, the more mercury it is likely to contain. So, you know, the marlin that we catch in the deep sea and migratory albacore will have higher content. You compare that to skipjack. Albacore has a life of 7 years, whereas a skipjack has an expected life of 3 years. So the shorter time that that fish is in the water means that they're less likely to have ingested methyl mercury. So I say that people should not stop eating fish. That is the main protein in the South Pacific. It's better to look at the species that you're eating and try and protect yourself by eating the smaller fish like the skipjack, reef fish, because they have a very short life in comparison, and even consider the canned skipjack. I would also call on the SPC as the science regional body to conduct proper fish sampling. I did some fish sampling on behalf of the Biodiversity Research Institute, and they found that the samples I sent them had high content. But it would be better to have a regional UN body do the sampling so that people could be assured it was correct, to find out, and then to be able to advise Pacific people on how, which species they should stick to. I do not have any concerns about methyl mercury in the fish that we export. I know some of the countries near the equator have very large export business to the EU, and there might be concerns that their consumers would be put off by knowing the mercury level. I have no such fears because I think the mercury in the fish in the Mediterranean and Atlantic Ocean are probably higher than those in the South Pacific. So I think we would compare very well. But it is, why is it a concern that people are taking methyl mercury into their bodies? Because it is recognised as an endocrine disrupting chemical. That is to say, methyl mercury will change the way the hormones in your body work in both humans and animals, including fish. So there may be very long-term effects by ingesting small amounts every day in the fish you eat, and they might add up in the long term to a large accumulation, which might present problems. So we need to know more, but we certainly right now we should stop polluting the ocean by treating it like a wastebasket, and then have some good sound research carried out as to what is in our fish. Not just mercury, there are other minerals, that cadmium or lead, which should also be considered, but the main thrust under the Minamata Convention is against mercury. Thank you.